that's really not realistic. Maybe if you hire somebody in their early to mid-20s, you might be able to shift their trajectory in a meaningful way and move them from a 6 to a 10. But it's highly unlikely. People are pretty well baked by the time they come into an employment opportunity. So I think with great coaching and really strong culture and great camaraderie, you can take an 8 and make them a 9.
Thank you so much for tuning into Journey with Christian Dieva's podcast. I'm your host, Christian Dievas. This next guest, he is the co-founder of the real estate Keller Williams Capital Properties in Washington, D.C., and grew their organization to 8 locations, nearly $100 million in revenue top line, all through and in spite of the financial crisis. So you think you should listen to this guy during this period of time? You bet your ass you should. Probably should share this episode with a friend or maybe even one of your colleagues. He earned his spot on the Inc. 5000 honor roll and his company recognition on multiple lists, including Washington Business Journal list of the fastest growing companies in the DC area and Washington Post list of top workplaces. Now, despite his entrepreneurial success, this is what is so humbling about this man. He always found himself in the same predicament, searching for happiness after each accomplishment, making trade-offs at every step, basically saying, hey, you know what? I'm making these sacrifices, but what for? Okay? And I think many of us are in that situation. I've been in that situation where, you know what? I lost my wife, but I built an incredible business. Was it worth it? I'm not sure. And that's what we're going to dive into today. He is now the CEO and founder of Alchemy of Money, which they focus on building incredible entrepreneurs, helping them manage their financial numbers, offering bookkeeping and CFO services, financial coaching, and private investment opportunities. Please welcome the CEO of Alchemy of Money, my friend, Brandon Green. How you doing today, Brandon?
Hello, Christian. I'm great. Thank you for having me today. I'm very pleased to be here.
Man, I'm looking forward to this conversation. And one of the things that I found very interesting, and I want to dive in, before we dive into all the fun stuff with real estate and your growth and scale and up to the right trajectory, and even with Alchemy of Money, I really want to talk a little bit about Brandon. And I thought this was really interesting. You said searching for happiness after each accomplishment. And at what point in your journey did that really hit you? Did you feel like you hit that kind of brick wall? You're like, wait a minute. And you stopped and you're like, what am I doing this for?
Yeah. So I do distinctly remember a moment. I had been working for years to have the financial resources to buy a house in Washington, D.C., a beautiful, big home in a lovely neighborhood. And I had a clear vision of what I wanted that home to be and worked for a long time to do it. And I finally did it. And we settled on the house. And I remember standing in the dining room of my brand new house on the day of settlement, looking out the window, not thinking about my accomplishment or this big, beautiful house that we bought, but what my next house would be like. And I thought, wait a minute. Right? Can I not even enjoy the moment of the accomplishment for an afternoon before I'm already thinking about what the next thing is? And I began to just see how by projecting into the next accomplishment, which has been critical to my success overall, was also robbing me of some of my own enjoyment and happiness. And I needed to kind of reconcile that and figure out how do I have both the drive and energy to accomplish something next and appreciate what I already have. So that was a big aha awareness for me as I'm literally the afternoon of settlement of this big, beautiful house thinking about my next house and not thinking, oh, look what's beautiful around me that I just did after 10 years of hard work. So when you ask that question, that moment comes to mind, and it brought me a new level of self-awareness around this dynamic.
So now, walking through that, what do you do on a daily cadence to make sure that that is top of mind for you? That you make sure that there is gratitude, that there is gratefulness, that you're like, enjoy the present. You're still motivated. You're still ambitious, accomplishing those big projects, accomplishing those big tasks, but also saying, you know what, I'm enjoying this journey of it.
Yeah. I would say it's a couple things. One is a level of acceptance that there is a way that I am wired to drive towards the next accomplishment and not feeling bad about that at all and saying, I don't know why that's the way I am, but there is this thing that I'm like, next, right? So that's just accepting that that is a part of my being. The other is incorporating into my calendar clear, blocked out opportunities for rest. For example, this weekend, I'm actually headed to Costa Rica for a 4-day meditation retreat. And meditation has been a really big part of helping me stay grounded and centered on the other side of my presence and well-being to kind of manage the two sides of me. So tactically, it's like I got to go on a meditation retreat once a year. I need to meditate a couple times a week, and that seems to keep the monster at bay, or rather keep the monster productively and effectively focused might be a good way to put it. So that's really what I've incorporated in, that your listeners could think through and say, look, it's not about changing yourself as much as it is perhaps acknowledging who you are and how that dynamic plays out in your life, and maybe adding one or two things into your routine that counterbalance that dynamic and make it healthier overall.
So, okay, this is interesting, and I want to kind of dive deeper into this. Looking, if you could just, like kind of almost beta test, like, A to B, from what you were when you were building and scaling something and you were not meditating toward now, and you're meditating but also scaling and building something.
Yes.
Have you seen a better, more maybe just mental healthness, or like what? I'm just curious, comparing and contrasting that period of time versus this period of time, just adding that one aspect of meditation. What are some things that you're noticing are drastically different?
Well, I certainly feel better, like physically, emotionally, mentally. I feel better. It's also manifested in the business that I believe I'm a much more effective and compassionate leader too. Like prior to this meditation routine, I definitely was really quite edgy. I still can be edgy. Let's make no mistake about it. But I led with edginess all the time, and that burned out a lot of great staff people. And really, I rode my team really hard because I would show up every day with, a hammer. Every day was a hammer. Every problem had a hammer solution, right? Boom, 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 boom. Now I'm like, well, a hammer is a good tool in your toolbox, certainly. But there's other tools too. And perhaps if you don't take out a hammer every day, you may be able to curate a better, more productive team, and everybody can have a more enjoyable experience. So that is distinctly different now. I think through every day, all right, do I need the hammer or not? Right? In most of the cases, I don't. Versus before, I probably pulled it out as my primary tool.
So, and this is, I want to dive into this because this is going to loop us into obviously your scale of a 9-figure, real estate, definitely in 2006. But you really focused, and we were talking offline, like one of your biggest focus, you were a very operational individual as well, but also what you really enjoyed is the vision, the mission, the value, really developing the culture. And I'm intrigued because we see individuals like Steve Jobs, and we, very well-known entrepreneur, et cetera, but he had that kind of, stick approach, right? But this is more compassionate, which I think is very interesting in today's world, empathetical. I'm not comparing and contrasting those individuals. I'm really just comparing, like, obviously this situation right now in regards to learning from what you're doing now, and obviously seeing that up to the right trajectory, adding that kind of, instead of that stick approach, to that compassion and empathy. Do you feel like there's a stronger synergistic culture because of that kind of leadership style, Brandon?
Yes, I am clear that my job as a CEO is to be clear and set the vision and direction of where we're headed for the company. That's absolutely number one. And a number two that's directly related to that is the team configuration at my direct report level. That I have to be very, very thoughtful of and curate super clearly. And then number three are the numbers. I'm responsible for ensuring the financial well-being of the company, that we have enough capital to go forward. Everything else is kind of everything else, right? And so as I now in my newest venture where I'm scaling, I'm toggling in and out of those roles, and many others too, of course, but not losing sight of the fact that when my calendar is full and my email is overflowing, is the vision, direction, mission clear for the company? Does everybody know where we're headed and what we're up to and what we're doing? Do I have the right people on the bus and the right seats, or do I need to work on that more? And then, what's the revenue showing up as, and what are the expenses, and can we manage that? So in some ways, this opportunity now in my life, having had the experience scaling the previous company, has given me a lot more clarity on what my role needs to be and how I need to configure the team around me to both drive a company at scale, but also to modulate and sort of bounce off, or to balance some of my characteristics that are, strengths and weaknesses. So I'm just a lot more thoughtful and aware of those dynamics, whereas before, It was just like go, 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 go. And like hard work will work it out. And that is true to only a degree. And then you realize there is a limit to how hard you can work. And you have to bring other things into the picture if you really want to grow that company.
And I love this approach because this is something personally I had to work through. I was one of those individuals who was this busyness. And recently, within the last 24 to 36 months, I've been really trying to get myself staying in that alpha theta state, really slowing myself down and find the high leverage activities. So with that being said, Brandon, now looking back at scaling, I mean, again, $100 million top line, that's huge, really. And you were kicking butt. But now looking back at that, what were those high leverage activities that you wish you would have focused on and that you're focusing on now? And like you mentioned, team, but really structuring the team properly, maybe the numbers as well. What did those look like and making sure that you don't divert your attention for things that really are kind of like vanity metrics? You're measuring the wrong thing. It's not actually moving the company forward. It's not moving the culture forward. It's not moving the synergy forward. So looking back at that, I'm curious, what have you noticed being self-aware and analyzing that?
The number one thing, and I'm 100% clear on this, is who I hire. Previously, I gave myself a lot of passes to hire people that were, I don't know, in a pinch, because I was busy. Probably a good fit, but, or I'm sure they'll figure it out. And then, a lot of that kind of hiring I did. And pretty much every time it blew up in my face and I was back and trying to recreate it, taking tons of shortcuts in the hiring process, specifically references. I hated checking references, hardly ever checked them. And I fell in love with candidates who sold me on their amazingness. And then I would get them in. I'd be like, what? Who are you? Right? So that created a huge mess in my company multiple times over. And over time, I learned. Now I realize there's nothing more important than choosing the right team members in the organization. And so I spent a lot more time interviewing. I check references like crazy. I actually was checking references until 8 o'clock last night on a key hire in one of our portfolio companies that could make or break that division, and it could be multiple millions of dollars in revenue. You can bet I'm checking references. Right? And it was fascinating, and it changed my order of candidates too. So that really has been a lesson learned that I'm bringing into this new company and saying that, if you're not any good at hiring, I get it, I certainly wasn't either, then you will always struggle to scale because you actually have to get good at hiring, and you will never be amazing at hiring because it is an ever ongoing fluid process of self-discovery, market alignment, business synergy alignment. It's a dynamic, fluid process. But you've got to commit to it as a leader if you want to grow a company beyond solo entrepreneurism.
How do you look at it? Because I've had some conversations regarding this where it's like you got the skills, you also got the mission, the value. Sometimes they have the skills, but they don't align with the mission, the value, the culture. Or do you you gravitate a little bit more as long as they align with the vision, mission and value, the culture, then we could always establish the skills, but we want them to be like on a scale 1 to 10. We want them to be at 8 at a skill, but we can always get them to 10. So I'm just curious, how do you look at that, Brandon, when you're hiring through that?
I think I'm much more pessimistic today in my ability to change people than I was before. I really believed for a good long time I could take a 6 and coach them to be a 10. And or to take their 20-degree misalignment with values and reduce it to 5%, right? And my experience, and I would say most leaders would articulate this similarly, is that's really not realistic. Maybe if you hire somebody in their early to mid-20s, you might be able to shift their trajectory in a meaningful way and move them from a 6 to a 10. But it's highly unlikely. People are pretty well baked by the time they come into an employment opportunity. So I think with great coaching and really strong culture and great camaraderie, you can take an 8 and make them a 9, or a 9 and make them a 10. But I think any more than that is unlikely to happen. So when I'm looking for alignment and skills and values and so forth, I'm like, okay, we have an opportunity to make very minor modifications maybe to how this person thinks and operates today. So let's assume we make no modifications. How are they going to perform in our organization?
Interesting. Okay, so you're assuming baseline. We hire them as is, and they don't change, go up or down or anything. And guess
Correct.
what? Is that going to work in the ecosystem of what we've got going on already? And is it going
That's
to
right.
be make or break that? Okay, I like that approach.
And
I'm curious.
that's how
Go ahead.
people are, right? People change because something happens within them, right? And it is a multifaceted dynamic, and it's rarely their employer who causes them to change. Now, they may adapt temporarily to something, but if you're looking for a long term fit, then the adaptation will wear off, which is why you'll get like amazing people for the first few months, and then they kind of settle into their natural thing, and you're like, I thought I was hiring a 9, and you're a 6.5, right? What happened? Right? They were probably good at sales, is what happened. They sold you into stuff, and you bought it. So that sort of clear-eyed perspective on people. And look, I love people. I love coaching. I love helping inspire and empower. I've also become a very practical businessman where I'm like, and maybe we will just not succeed in any of that. And we should therefore make choices around that presumption. And then everything else is upside.
So let me ask you also with like the personality style, because like if you're, hiring a customer service, C-suite versus, VP of sales, they're going to be totally different personalities. And there's a
Yeah.
lot of, and I found this very interesting. There's a lot of like research on personality, kind of styles, qualities, etc. And so it's like, I was talking to one friend of mine and he's like, hey, when they take this personality test for sales, VP of sales, this is the qualities that I'm looking for. This is the characteristics I'm kind of looking for that really fit that and that have that intensity, that focus, right? Customer service, you want more of that kind of whatever, right? My point is how much emphasis when you're hiring do you put on that personality style at all? Does it align with that, or is it more of like you just talked about, kind of the skills and making sure that the right fit already?
I put a lot of weight on personality styles. I'm a big believer in various behavioral profile assessments. I think those can be incredibly insightful. I'll give you one really interesting example. So in one of our portfolio companies, as I mentioned, we're hiring for this key person who would partially be reporting to me and partially be reporting to somebody else in the organization who is a very different individual than me. If it were up to me, I would hire candidate A, but because this is a joint report setup, we're probably going to hire candidate B, and the distinct difference is in the personality style and how empathy is manifesting with them. So I'm good with very direct, relatively dry people reporting to me. I actually, in some cases, prefer that because we can just boom, 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 and get it done. This other person, though, they'll never synergize. And because that's a critical relationship, a really direct or dry person won't work there. So we're having to look at skill sets and say, yep, that's important. But the synergy and the harmony in that report to, report up relationship is really where the magic starts to happen. And if you can't get the spark, then you'll never access the skills.
So you're looking too deep as well within your organization and making sure that there is, because that's what I'm always intrigued with. See, I scaled my business to 8 figures, so we never got to where it was like 2 or 3 deep. I had my C-suite, hiring it out. A lot of times I was involved with the hiring process, even because it was such a relatively small team. I knew everybody. But when you're hitting that 9-figure run rate, you're talking some individuals where you got people on your team that got hired from HR, and you have no idea sometimes. So I'm curious on your how were you able to kind of plant that seed, these systems, these processes like you were mentioning? Because at some point, you may or may not be involved with every hiring process. I'm not sure. But if you weren't, how did you make sure that you were able to streamline that and make sure that you didn't lose that integrity of that hiring process?
That's a really good question. I mean, you can get pretty far down the road with the founder, CEO, doing at least a cursory interview of everybody who comes into the organization. Some really big organizations still today are like, you get 5 minutes with the CEO and they do, I guess they attempt to do some sort of gut check on this person, right? But the truth is, you will, if you scale, get to a point where if you're empowering your people right, they're going to be making hires of people you never even meet and debatably probably would not work well reporting directly to you. So you do have to create some sort of program where new hires come into the company and learn about the company history and what the values are and who the founder is or the CEO or the board or how this whole thing works. Like all the stuff that you as a founder just naturally do because it's in your blood and it's like your baby. You just tell people about this. As you get 2 or 3 or 4 or 6 layers into the company, that doesn't happen unless it's programmed in systematically with orientations and more systematized interviews, and which tends to bring up an interesting evolutionary point in business leadership, which is not every leader is good for every stage of scale in a company. So I did ultimately step out of my company and sold most of it. And in that process, I realized that I am a really great startup entrepreneur to mid-size. When it gets to a place where it's 100 million or so in revenue and more, the level of system, structure, bureaucracy that ultimately has to be created for it to move forward isn't my jam. Like I didn't enjoy that. My level of enjoyment went down the bigger it got. And there came a point where I was like, oh, well, I guess because I'm a startup to mid-size entrepreneur, that's actually my sweet spot. So therefore, I need to be able to create a transaction on these companies at a certain stage so that we can move it to a private equity firm or, whoever is going to bring in a formalized management team and they're going to, right? So that's another level of this, like not only self-awareness of who you're hiring, but how you're thinking about your own journey as a leader in your company you're growing. You're very few people, I can think of one person in my mind that can run a full life cycle of a business and start it and run it at $1 billion. Like that is a rare bird because the skills required to run it at each iteration are so vastly different that very few people can do that.
Okay, and I'm so glad we went down this a little bit. I want to pack this a little bit further. Assuming that what you just said is correct, which is when you're looking at hiring, let's say, because a lot of our listeners are mid 7-figure run rates, and they're looking to scale that mid 8-figure, and then though, who you hire now will get you to where you're at, but then obviously where you're at, you need someone else, right? And so I'm curious, what are those breakpoints, Brandon? What are those? What is that? For those that are listening, you should be aware of, like, okay, when we hit 40 million top line, okay, we need to start looking at rehiring, restructuring our team, kind of, pulling some people off because we want to get that 9-figure, et cetera. So what are those breakpoints that these individuals should be aware of with their team, because it is so imperative?
The team that gets you from 0 to 1 million is one sort of subset of a variety of teams you'll have. They need to be jack of all trades. Everybody can roll up their sleeves and do whatever they need to do and get this thing off the runway. And that is a team that is very unique, and I am only a few people probably from that founding team will carry you forward to phase 2, which is 1 million to 10 million in revenue. When you get from 1 million to 10 million in revenue, you realize your single source revenue chain that got you to 1 million needs to now be double or triple sources of revenue to get you to 10 million. Most people can't get to 10 million with one source of revenue, but you have to focus on one source of revenue to get to 1 million in revenue. So this 1 million to 10, now you have 3 or 4 different sources of revenue that has to be managed different. It's usually a different team. Then you get from 10 million to usually 50, maybe 75 million. It's another different game. You've got to bring in now more professional management. You've got to have a CFO. What's that? You got a CTO, or executive leadership really is required to scale that thing up to 75 million that would be candidates that would never have been interested in your company at 1 million or 5 million. And the director of operations at 5 million is not likely the director of operations at 50 million. Like very different situation. And then I would carve out the third, which is sort of 75 million up to some sort of big transaction where you might bring in investors or private equity or something. Another whole level, right, where you've got board of directors, outside capital investors, a lot more legal, a lot more compliance, and the day-to-day of a leader could very well be spending a lot of time with attorneys. So if you're out there thinking, how do I think through my business structure, I'd say 0 to 1 million, 1 million to 10, 10 to 75, 75 and up. And who is your leadership team that will at least take you up one ladder notch, right? It is unrealistic as a $1 million company to say, I'm going to hire the leadership team that'll take me to 100 million. you can't afford them, is the truth. So hire someone who can take you to 10 or 15, and maybe they're going to be so amazing and grow that they can ride with you the whole journey, but probably not.
That makes sense, and it's good to have that perspective. I appreciate kind of really hitting those hurdles, if you will, those breakpoints for our audience. I want to also ask a little bit on the financial side. I had a story where, and I told this on a different podcast, where it was like when we were first starting our business, we had $100,000. All of our merchant accounts held up the money. It was a horrible situation. Now, whenever I build another business, I'm very aware of having numerous different merchant accounts, all that structure because of that very horrible situation, etc. Now looking back at it, analyzing that situation, I learned obviously a lot, as well as like just certain metrics as well. It was interesting. I was measuring certain vanity metrics that were really not moving the needle further in the business. And I want to ask you, Brandon, because obviously you scaled a business much higher than mine. What were some vanity metrics during your journey? What were some metrics that you were like, okay, why are we measuring this? Is this actually producing, margin? Is it producing a big result? Is it, moving the money needle further? And also, what was like one or two things that happened that you have become very aware of now? And I'm talking just the financial side, the business structure of things to ensure that, hey, you know what? We're not going to get ourselves in that situation again.
Yeah. Well, on the metric side, we all know that you've got to be paying attention to revenue and net profitability, right? Which means you've got to manage expenses. That's sort of obvious. What becomes a little less obvious, though, are what are the direct lead indicators that feed into the result of revenue or feed into the result of profitability. In the scaling of the real estate brokerage, we discovered that one of the biggest lead indicators was how many appointments our team leaders were going on to recruit new agents into the company. And we needed to manage on a week-to-week basis how many appointments they were going on. And we had a whole chain that set up that would say, okay, number of appointments would lead to number of calls would lead to number of appointments would lead to a certain conversion rate, so on and so forth. But we said every week in the management meeting, how many appointments we had, how many appointments we had, how many appointments we had. And we were able to singularly focus the organization around that one number, which was critical. As ownership and leadership, you have to focus on a coach's scoreboard, which has all kinds of metrics on it. But you got to get your team focused on just one number, and that's the number that's really going to, and if you got to figure out what is that one number that's going to drive things forward. So in every business I'm involved in now, I have that same conversation, which is, yeah, I know we got to focus on revenue, expenses, and net profit, and we should have clear metrics and goals around that. But what are the drivers of that? And how do we focus on the drivers? Because that's the day-to-day action you can impact on a Monday or a Tuesday or a Wednesday. If I'm an employee, some department or somewhere, how do I impact net profitability? Well, you better know by understanding the one number you're accountable to and how that number relates to all the other numbers that leads to net profitability. So, this is from Predictable Success has a really good model for this. The 4 disciplines of execution from Franklin Covey is where we pulled a lot of this methodology. It really drives into this type of this area.
So let me ask you this. So, because I'm always intrigued with this, and I love how you just said that one number, and you're obviously reverse engineer it, and everything is attached to that one. I've seen, and I've talked to a lot of individuals that have that same structure, but slightly different. How micro do you get with your measurement of these metrics and numbers? And what I mean by this is like, when you're adding that, like you mentioned, that one streamline to get to million, then you all of a sudden add 2 or 3 different verticals, right? Do you measure that at a micro level in each one of those, in acquisition, your cost to acquire a customer, et cetera, and then as well as marketing? And how deep do you go into that? Because you could get really, analytical if you want.
You can, and it can get a bit overwhelming. The answer is yes, I get quite deep in it, and we have a whole dashboard of all these different metrics. I'll give you an example in one of our portfolio companies that's really far into the weeds. So we have a staging business, and we do residential and commercial staging around the country for big sporting events, and think of you got the press tent, the athletes. Like we do all the furniture and the accessories and get all that stuff done. Well, you can imagine, if you think about that business for a minute, there's a lot of inventory back and forth, right? And the margin in a business like that is made by managing your inventory well, which means the movers of that inventory need to have awareness of how they're handling furniture and need to be tracking not only how they're handling furniture, but how many trips they're taking to and from the site. So a metric for our lead mover is how many extras did you perform that week? The number goal is 0, right? So, but I know as a business investor in that company that if the team is taking too many trips to the site, we're spending too much money and we're reducing our margin on that particular installation, which has a corresponding effect everywhere in the company. So they have a number every week we're measuring, which is number/0, because 0 is the goal. And it's rarely 0, but it's better than it was because we're actually now paying attention to it. So that's an example, like way into the weeds of a business where and into a role where understanding metrics, which are often very easy in sales, is a lot harder in that operational capacity. And you'll find that organizations that are really, really run well are doing something like that across all different departments eventually as they mature. This is I'd say a bit more of a mature business. This is not a startup. Startup's a little bit more streamlined. But if you're listening and you have a business that's been around for a handful of years, think through in your operations, what is the one team lead can track that would lead up then to better net profitability? It takes a lot of work, honestly, Christian, to find that number and make sure it's the right number that's actually going to have impact.
And I think that's why it's so important to have these conversations, because I remember so distinctively, we were running YouTube ads and we were looking at the measurement and we were measuring for cost per, and we were optimizing every campaign for cost per phone call. What was our cost per phone call? We knew if we kept in this margin that we would be profitable. But what was interesting then is we leveraged Hyros, which then measured actually the acquisition of each one of those campaigns, were we making money off of this campaign? And then we started realizing when we were starting to optimize for the profitability of these campaigns and which one was actually bringing money in, then we started realizing the cost per phone call was relatively kind of higher in this campaign. Yep. And it was so interesting how, like, if we would have kept down this path of optimizing for cost per phone call, we would have totally missed, and we would have turning off campaigns that were actually bringing in money. Exactly. And so that's why it's just an important question to have. That's why I always love to ask these conversations. So I want to dive into this. How did you guys get to that solution? How did you guys find that? I would imagine, was it a process? Was it more like, okay, understanding it, the story that what did that look like?
Well, it's an ongoing process where we, as the investors' leadership team and employees, are constantly interrogating whether or not that's the right number to be tracking. But it started because we realized our margin was decreasing and our overall cost to move things around was increasing. And we're like, well, that's a problem. So how do we, on a day-to-day, roll-to-roll level, fix that? And come up with a number that everybody can be paying attention to that would be predictive of improvement in that area. I'll give you another example where we don't know. So in the new company I have, Alchemy and Money, that we launched, where we're doing financial planning, bookkeeping, and tax for real estate agents, we're still really new, right? We've got 60 entities that we're managing. We've been at it now for a while, so we're not brand new, but we're still new enough that I can't tell you for sure what the metrics are for all the different roles. They're starting to form. So, for example, we're starting to see that for every member who comes into the company, they need a bookkeeper and an account manager, and there's a certain number of members each bookkeeper and account manager can handle. And we're starting to see probably where that is. We know how many calls we need to make to convert members. That number's starting to materialize, but it's still too new to be able to, with any confidence or with a lot of confidence, say this is the number. So we're talking about it all the time. Eventually, we're going to come up with a nice dashboard of metrics that work for this business type and have everybody measure to that. But that is an evolution in the business.
So a lot of it's not like a concrete, it's more of like, just like you mentioned, evolution. Hey, we see these red flags happening in the business. Okay, let's reverse engineer what's going on. Hey, let's go ahead and adjust this. I'm curious, what does that timeline look like to test that? Like, hey, we're going to go ahead and modify this, and then we're going to test it for 60 days. And are we seeing improvements over here? Because I know sometimes there is a laggard of it.
Yeah, that's good. My gut on that says 60 to 90 days. Like if you're measuring something and nothing's happening after 60 to 90 days, you're probably measuring the wrong thing. Or the metrics that are coming back to you are not right, right? So, when you get into this, you realize, well, how do you know that the numbers are right? Right? So there's so many layers to it, and that's why I don't recommend this be like a project you and your team like figure out on a Wednesday versus saying, no, this is a methodology around running our business tight that we will always and forever be deploying and analyzing and asking questions around with the overall aim of some big business objectives around net profitability.
And that's why and that starts with the team. It starts with that hiring process, which I love how we look that around. That's awesome.
It does. It starts with smart people who can see both deep into the organization, but broad across what we're doing. And there's only a handful of people in a company who will have that perspective, but it better be the 2 or 3 or 4 people that report to you as the CEO or founder, or you're going to have, if you're the only one that has that sort of broad perspective, it is a lonely show up there.
Let me ask you also on the front end, the client side. What I was talking to a friend of mine, he runs a wealth manager firm, and he had like about $1 billion AUM. He actually sold off some of his clients, about 80%, because they started analyzing, and majority of their revenue was actually coming from the top 20%, Pareto principle. Yeah. And then what was happening was he was able to identify where they were coming from, their avatar, if you will, and then he was able to, really dial that in, and obviously he scaled it back to $1 billion AUM. So what was interesting though in that situation was he was able to stop, kind of really analyze what he has and say, okay, where's the revenue coming from, and where's our team spending. So during your evolution of that business and you're up to the right trajectory, were there pivot points where you're like, okay, let's relook at our clientele, let's take a look at our customers, et cetera, and say, hey, do we need to adjust our avatar? Do we need to, or what does that look like? What did that process look like for you guys?
Yes, so getting that level of business insight is tough sub 1 million. Like that starts to turn on with more clarity in the $1 million to $10 million range. However, even sub 1 million, you and the team should be looking at the results that you're generating every 6 to 12 months and say, is this thing working? Like, do we have an economic model around this business that is sustainable? Are the customers willing to pay for the service we think is valuable at the level they need to pay to make this company profitable? I mean, I've had a lot of great business ideas that turned out to be just great business ideas, but not great businesses. And so you have to be realistic about that and analyze that and be willing to acknowledge you may have a great idea the world won't pay for. And unless you have, the funds to do it anyway, then you probably can't do anything with it. So that question, both using metrics and also just customer interviews, is an important one. And it is really the critical one that determines whether or not you get the jet off the runway or you stall at like $500 or $1 million in revenue, which is a really tough place to stall because you just don't have the resources you need, but you're really busy, and it can be kind of a miserable life.
I appreciate it. I love what you said. I think we all been in that experience. So this is a great idea. Well, there's no business structure behind it, so there's no monetization. I love that. Brandon, also, and that makes me understand a little bit more like that evolution of it, really, capitalizing on those feedback loops of the customers and those customers' questionnaire and so forth. When you're looking at exiting. Okay. What did that process look like? I'd love to just unpack that a little bit. There are some that are listening. I have an exit, but there are some that are, what all that it entails. I've had some M&A advisors on, and it's just always interesting. I'd love to get a perspective, definitely at that high caliber, just really what you need to put in, making sure that everything was, crossing the T, dotting the I kind of structure, and making sure that you get the most valuation out of it.
Yeah. So that's a great conversation. A couple thoughts. One would be, it is helpful if, as you're getting into a business and you intend to want to exit, you make that determination early if you can. Not everybody does, but it does help inform some decisions along the way. So if you know you're going to exit, then you'll probably shoot for a bigger, broader goal from day one than if you're like, I think this is just going to be a lifestyle business for me, which, by the way, there's nothing wrong with at all. Those can be excellent ways to drive family income. So thinking about that. But then realizing that no matter how much planning you do for an exit, it's very likely to materialize in a very different way than you imagined. It could be at a very different stage, earlier or later. It could be to a different partner. You could exit in a different way. Maybe you fully exit, maybe you partially exit. And you, if you do really put your heart and soul into the business to grow it, which you probably have to in order to do it, you will likely run into the wall I've run into and many founders have, which is you realize you and your business have kind of become one, and an exit forces a bit of an existential question, which is, well, what are you going to do with yourself then? It really challenges the ego, Christian. I remember when I wasn't even fully exited, so to speak, but I was no longer running things day to day, and my email box fairly dramatically got really quiet. And I thought, was I even needed all this time? Like, I didn't realize the degree to which I was being personally validated by how many emails I was getting, because that was my endorphin rush of, oh, they need me, they need me, they need me. I'm valuable, I'm valuable, I'm valuable. And then when that email stopped, I was like, who am I? I had an identity crisis. I was like, what? And then I was like, I've done so much good work on myself. How have I not answered these questions? So I would just say that think of exits strategically to the degree that you can, but mostly know that it's going to play out probably very different than you think, and focusing day to day on growing a big company. If you're successful in that, the exit too is very likely to be successful, however it plays out.
Okay, I like that. So what you're saying is that you obviously have a clarity of what you want, but also kind of be flexible with the expectation of what that comes down to, and contractual. When you were working through that process, I know I've heard some where it's taken, depending upon who you're selling it to, it could be very quick. Definitely if you have everything already structured, all the financials, all that other stuff. Or I've heard where it's 24, 36 months close, and it takes just every little ounce of energy. What did you do? Were you like 2 or 3 years out? You're like, okay, hey, I'm thinking of exiting, and you were starting to like build out the foundation so that that it was able to collapse that time frame on the front end. What did you do to ensure that it wasn't going to be this long heartache?
Well, I know very few people who have had fast exits, and if they've had fast exits, it's not been an opportune exit. For me, it was, I would say, a phased process. Phase one was just quietly acknowledging to myself that I wanted to exit in some capacity soon. Phase two was acknowledging that I was playing a critical role in the company and I needed to backfill that first. Then phase three was, well, who's going to buy my shares, right? Like, which maybe I should have thought of in phase one, but phase three, like, who's going to buy? And like, who's the buyer, right? Is this a sellable asset? And what's the multiple on that? And how is it facilitated? And, that took a good long time to figure out. And then actually closing the deal is another phase. I mean, for me, I would say I really was aware of the possibility in late 17. By 2018, I was clear I wanted to do it. By the end of 2018, I'd hired my replacement. By 2019, I was pretty much out. Then 2020 hit, and I was sucked back in for a period. As we all were like, what's happening to the world, right? So I did not end up closing the transaction until the end of 2020. So it was a long process, for sure. And I learned a lot in that. What would I do over again? I don't know. It's hard to say. But I would say now I am more thoughtful about what needs to be put in place now to make for a more successful exit. I'll give you an example. In Alchemy of Money, I'm sure we will exit. I don't know when. I don't actually have a timeline for sure because we're still so early. But I do know eventually we'll sell it to someone. Therefore, we're tracking our metrics really clearly and cleanly right now so that someday I can tell a story to an investor of those first couple founding years. That's actually a very important component to your overall valuation. And being able to kind of say how many members you added and what the issues were and how you were working through those. It's a big part of the story that gets somebody excited to buy your company. I know that. So we're documenting that really clearly for some future sale to nobody we know someday. And, we'll see how that plays out.
See, and that's why I love what you said there, because what you're saying is like, hey, you know what? Maybe build out the foundation now so that you're not in a situation where you have to, clean up everything in a very short period of time to make sure you sell it. It's like, hey, I can sell this at any time, any moment, because we've already did the due diligence. And I like that approach, saying, hey, we're going to build out the foundation properly. And then whenever that happens, 10, 15, 20, 30 years down the road, when it's a big, whatever. But now you don't have to be in a situation where you're like, oh, crap. Brandon, I want to ask again, because I really appreciate your time on here, because just unpacking your expertise and your experience in scaling and growth, and really helping us understand those pivot points, those pain points that people should be aware of in your hiring process, in the structure of the metrics and the finances, et cetera, and finding those one or two leverage points that really move the needle further. When you were exiting, I always found this interesting because you can structure the deal so creatively, and I've heard some crazy deals. I've heard some like very simple deals. Obviously, we can't really dive into it, because I don't want to dive into that structure of it. But how did you approach the thinking of it? Did you reverse engineer and say, Brandon, okay, and you talk to yourself and say, okay, well, how do I want to live? Do I want to be actively into the company, or maybe take some equity, or do I want to be, like, hey, write it out and I'm over to the next thing? How did you think about it and approach that conversation with yourself?
Yeah. So I asked myself, and by the way, I hired coaches and attorneys. Like, I was very well advised and supported in this process. I did ask, though, like, what's actually most important to me here? And certainly a financial reward to recognize all my hard work was important to me. Though there was another thing, which was I wanted to retain the relationships. And at the time, I did not know that I would launch Alchemy and Money into the same industry. I had a feeling I would stick in the industry in some capacity. And I just spent 15 years building relationships in that industry that I knew were important and valuable, and I liked. So I thought, however I do this deal, I need to do so in a way that I remain connected to those relationships and into that network, and not burn bridges, because not burning bridges is highly likely to be very supportive of my next venture. And that's exactly how it's turned out to be. I rely heavily on the Keller Williams network to grow Alchemy and Money. I still own a very small percentage of my company. And the purpose was I wanted to stay connected to the network and continue to support and develop the network that got me to where I am today. And that is a strategic business alignment in the new business. Now, I could have just pushed everybody to a bigger deal and gotten a bigger check and probably pissed off a lot of people and ruined some relationships. But that would have been very short-sighted, and in the end would have been less money than ultimately what's going to happen, because this new company is being fed by the quality of those relationships I maintained. So that is an important component. I've seen other founders and friends of mine who are like, I want nothing to ever do with those people. I just want to check. I'll see you in the Bahamas. Great, right? But thinking through that is an important component to that process.
Yeah, and I appreciate you kind of helping us understand how, yourself walk through that, and like you mentioned, you had a lot of expertise and a lot of coaches, and it was really cool that you were humble yourself to say, you know what, this is my first time, so let's figure this out. And I regret doing a lot of that. I did not, when it was a very emotional situation, and I won't, get into it, but and that's really good to understand how you approached it, had those conversations, and aligned yourself and said, hey, these are the non-negotiable, these are the negotiables, and the structure of it can be, slightly adjusted, but the relationships were very important for you, which is
and that was harder. I will tell you, it took longer and it was harder. It's much more rewarding now, but it was very difficult, because after you run something for 15 years, you're tired and maybe even a little bitter, right? Because you're just burned out. And I had to fight through that burnout, knowing it was temporary. I just needed some time off, which I did take. It took like 2 years off. But it was hard to remind myself that my future self was counting on me to maintain these relationships. And I needed to put my ego aside a little bit and look at the bigger picture. That was my journey, right? Everybody has their own transaction journey, but that ultimately is how I thought about it. And I'm happy to say that's how I executed it. And the fruits of that endeavor are now clear in this new venture as we're building Alchemy of Money.
That's awesome. That's very exciting. I want to, Brandon, for those that want to reach out to you that are listening and want to be part of what you got going on, or maybe even learn a bit more about Alchemy of Money or even your story, how do they reach out to you and be part of what you got going on, man?
Yeah, you bet. So the company website is alchemyofmoney.co, alchemyofmoney.co. And one of the things I would love to see you do is to check out my blog. And join the blog. I send out Alchemy in Action blog post every week. It's on leadership, it's on finances, it's on all kinds of different topics. So you can find out all about us at alchemyofmoney.co and then join our blog. And we've got thousands of people now that are listening or watching and reading what we're doing, which I'm very, very humbled by, and put a lot of thought and effort into helping other entrepreneurs, no matter their industry, and certainly in real estate, grow and thrive in their businesses.
Awesome. And guys, those links will be in the description below. I'll put his website down there as well as LinkedIn and everything like that down there, so you guys can consume that content. I would highly recommend it. It's actually really got some really amazing stuff with the blog. It's very updated, and there's some really good subjects that I think many of our listeners should probably consume and read. So Brandon, I really appreciate you being on here and just again sharing your ups and downs and really getting micro with a lot of the details you shared today. I was taking notes over here, just applying it to my own structure where we're going. Brandon, I really appreciate it. I always love to ask my guests before I let you go, is there any last words of wisdom they'd like to share with our audience?
Yeah, the presence I like to bring with me is everything is exactly as it's supposed to be. And that is a comforting thought for an entrepreneur who is always trying to change its existing state into something else. And acknowledging that everything is exactly as it's supposed to be. Your journey is where it needs to be. And we know that by looking in hindsight at difficult periods or growth spurts that are challenging. There's a purpose to it. And so no matter where you are, whether you're in the highest of highs or the lowest of lows, you're exactly where you need to be right now. And you can both be grateful for that and have an eager anticipation for what's going to happen in the future.
Well said. That is some good words of wisdom. Guys, that is my friend, the CEO of Alchemy of Money, my friend, Brandon Green. Guys, that is Journey with Christian Evans podcast. Until next time, be uncommon if you can.